Currently 74 in Portland. I'm David Martin. Check back several times each day and don't miss a thing. Set a button to News Radio 101 FM KXL and KXL.com.
Aliens, bioduplication, nude conspiracies. Oh, my God, Clyde Lewis was right.
The loudspeaker spoke up and said, "Wait, Jimmy." The loudspeaker spoke up and said, "Run away, Jimmy." The loudspeaker spoke up and said, "Wait, Jimmy." Give up. Give up. Give up. Give up. Give up. Wait, Jimmy. Wait, Jimmy. Run away, Jimmy.
I'm Clyde Lewis, and this is Ground Zero. Ground Zero coming to you live from News Radio 101 FM, KXL in Portland, Oregon. And tonight, a special show for you. Oh, a lot of fun, actually. So tonight, if you want to tune in online, you can go to KXL.com. That's KXL.com. Also, you can go to groundzeromedia.org, and there you can get into the chat room and look at some of the articles we have. And I wanted to remind those who listen to this show on podcast that a lot of people say they really enjoy the podcast and that we provide all of our podcasts for free. We don't ask that you pay to get into the podcast. You just have to click. We're on iTunes. We're everywhere. But if you enjoy the show and the podcast, we'd like for you to consider a generous donation to help the podcast remain on the site. Or you can buy a T-shirt or a video. We got Ground T-shirts, Ground Zero T-shirts available. They're now available. We've just reopened the Ground Zero store. We got 2 videos to sell, and we also have the new T-shirts that have been designed by Matt Haley. They have the future Ground Zero logo on them, and we would love for you to purchase one. It all helps keeping the Ground Zero website up and running, and it keeps us all happy, because that way we can create more things and do more events. We've got some events that we're planning, and the way we plan them is most of them are out of pocket, and we'd like to be able to take some of the donation money and put it towards bringing people here to Portland, also bringing on special guests that you'd be surprised at what donations can do to help the show. So, if you need to, the PayPal donate button is right there on the front page of the website. And if you're listening to the podcast right now, go ahead and contribute. It's really a nice gesture on your part to contribute to the show. And tonight's show is a special show, really, as I said, a special show. When I first saw the previews to the movie Cowboys and Aliens, some kid that was in the theater goes, "Lame." He just said, "That's lame." I thought, what? I was annoyed by this, but I also thought the idea would be really cool. And there really hasn't been too much coverage about the possibility of UFOs and aliens on the wild frontier. However, I knew better because I have read so many stories about alien or celestial events recorded by cowboys on the frontier. It's about in the 1800s. And, think about this. Okay, it probably would have been terrifying for the people in small towns, small villages, to see something flying in the air and crashing to the ground, especially when the Wright brothers didn't get off the ground, during that time. They had no spaceships. They had no flying machines. It would have been like God appearing to them. And that's the thing that's most weird. Is I don't know if you can contemplate that idea. And historians really don't talk about the frontier. And they don't really talk about the idea that these spaceships could have appeared to cowboys or appeared on the frontier or appeared in the 19th century. The question is, did cowboys in America's Old West really encounter extraterrestrials and UFOs? Well, there's a book that's out, and it's called The Real Cowboys and Aliens, that records the stories. And my guest tonight is Noe Torres and John LeMay, both on the program tonight to talk about this very subject. And we think it'd be a really, really special show for everyone to listen in and to and just love the stories about the Old West. Are you guys both there? Both Noe and John, you there?
Hey, we're here.
It's good to hear you both on the air with us tonight. Thank you for joining us on Ground Zero.
Yes, very good. Clyde, I appreciate you having John LeMay and myself, Noe Torres, on your program tonight. We're looking forward to talking about the real Cowboys and Aliens, not the Hollywood laser blast made-up version.
Yeah. Now, Noe, you actually have recorded not only a lot of the cowboy and alien stories, but also the stories from Mexico or New Mexico. Am I correct?
Yes. Our focus in the past, Clyde, working with both my co-author John LeMay and my other good friend Ruben Uriarte, who is the MUFON director for Northern California, we've written a series of books about Roswell UFO crash-like events that have occurred in various places, including a couple of very interesting cases that haven't received very much publicity that occurred along the Texas-Mexico border. And I think as the show goes on tonight, we might explore those cases as well as the Cowboys and Aliens theme if we have a chance.
Fantastic. And John, have you both or any? John, have you seen the movie The Cowboys and Aliens film?
I did see it. I enjoyed it. I thought it was pretty good.
Yeah, a lot of people said they really liked it, but the critics didn't like it all that well. And I don't know if they really understand. They probably think it's all a new thing to have aliens and cowboys paired together. But I often wondered about that because I remember I thought to myself, wouldn't it be nice if there was a Western? And then all of a sudden, during the Western, you see this huge UFO land, and these guys just don't know what to do with it. And you pretty much put that together. I mean, it's 19th century aliens. I mean, we've heard about the aliens in the Bible. We've heard about the aliens everywhere else, but no one really covers that. John, what do you think would be the most, I guess you could say, surprising thing to hear about the frontier and alien stories?
Well, I would say what surprised me was I thought some of these real stories were even more far out than the movie. And for instance, one of the UFO encounters, if you can call it a UFO, I guess you should call it a USO, like an underwater or an unidentified submersible object. That was probably the most interesting story in the book because these people described it as looking like a mechanical caterpillar swimming through the water and spewing electricity. And I believe that was in Tacoma, Washington.
Really?
To me, that's much more strange than anything they had in the movie, and, this is something that was really reported in a real newspaper of the time.
I had never heard that story. I did a lot of research. I didn't hear about it. It was, where was it seen? Where was that mechanical caterpillar seen?
Like I said, in Tacoma, Washington, so it would have been probably in a lake somewhere.
Yeah, or it could have been in the Puget Sound. Wouldn't that be weird if they had some sort of a sea monster in the Puget Sound area like that would spew electricity? And that's very. I know that a lot of these sightings still remain. I know that there was a sighting that was in the 1860s. It was the Lumley sighting. That was in the Northwest. That was Montana, wasn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, what
Coyote Pass.
What exactly happened with that Lumley case?
Well, that's a hard one to peg down because he described it as kind of like a meteor streaking through the sky, and when he found it, he said it looked kind of like a meteor with hieroglyphics carved into it, and he also said that it was divided into compartments. So he didn't give a real clear description of it, because he says it looks like a meteor, and yet he also says that it's, divided into these different compartments. What did you think of that, Noe?
Well, one of the very strange aspects of that case, actually, and one that intrigues me quite a lot, is the fact that there were these strange symbols located on the object that Lumley encountered there that had fallen to the ground. Although in a general sense it looked like maybe a meteor or some kind of a rock. It looks sort of like a large rock, but what was intriguing, as I say, there was these symbols which Lumley described as hieroglyphics, and but they were of a nature that were, although they were similar to Egyptian hieroglyphics, nobody could really say that they actually were. They just had a similarity to them. And we find strange symbols to be a recurring theme in UFO stories that we've looked at both in the 1800s, as was the focus of our book, but also in other more modern cases, such as the famous story of the Roswell UFO incident in 1947, where an object crashed just north of the town of Roswell, John's hometown there. And some of the witnesses described seeing hieroglyphic-like writing on some of the metallic components that were recovered by Jesse Marcel and seen by several of the Roswell witnesses in 1947. So this is one of the most intriguing angles, I think, of the case from 1864, the explosion of a UFO that was seen by eyewitness Lumley.
And you also can also put the Kecksburg case into that pile, too, because when they saw in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, when they saw the craft crash, it was a bell-shaped craft. And when they saw that one crash, they said as well that it had strange hieroglyphic type writing on it.
Right. We see these recurring themes in UFO crash recovery cases. Very common element of them is that the witnesses notice not just a very strange object unknown to Earth science, obviously aerodynamic in design, but also there's often the symbols, the strange symbols, as in the Kecksburg UFO crash, the Roswell case, and numerous others. The cases that we covered in our other books, we have Ruben Uriarte and I have a book called Mexico's Roswell. There's been a couple of documentaries done on it by the History Channel, and that also is a very intriguing case in which artifacts were seen of a very unusual nature. So that's one of the themes that most has an impact, I think, on readers who see cases and read about cases where materials possibly extraterrestrial or interdimensional have been recovered at one of these crash sites.
It always seems like the Northwest and the Southwest have always been places where UFOs have crashed. We seem to draw, or not crash, but at least appeared, and some have crashed. We see and hear stories about crashes in Mexico, crashes in New Mexico, crashes in Texas. We hear about sightings in Oregon, sightings in Tacoma, and this dates back all the way to the 1800s. And tonight, my guests are going to talk about this even more in depth. We're going to find out that a lot of things happening in the 19th century are very similar to what's happening to us now in the 21st century. Cowboys and Aliens is in theaters, but this is the real stuff, the real story of Cowboys and Aliens. My guests tonight, Noe Torres and John LeMay are here on Ground Zero to talk about these very subjects. If you have any questions about UFOs and aliens in the frontier, by all means, give us a call tonight. You can call us up at 503-417-9595 or 1-800-733-1011. And we'll be back with more. Don't go away. Keep it here on Ground Zero.
Got an opinion? Call KXL now. 503-417-9KXL or 877-733-1011. Is Ground Zero on News Radio 101 FM KXL. Business as usual in the apocalypse. Ground Zero with Congress.
John LeMay, Noe Torres is on my show tonight. Here to talk about the Cowboys and the Aliens, the real stories of the 19th century UFO sightings and alien encounters. Right there, Wild West, somewhere out there in the Northwest, we see and read about these stories. And they've kind of been kept under wraps with a new movie that has been released called Cowboys and Aliens. Got people talking about them again. Just how common, Noe, were sightings of UFOs and alien encounters in the 1800s?
That's a very good question, Clyde. We looked at literally hundreds of cases from the 1800s. We were looking at everything that was UFO related from the year 1800 to 1899. And I should just say briefly that this started as a project that I had in mind to do a story on the infamous UFO crash near Aurora, Texas.
Yes.
In 18 let's see if I
was it 97? I think it was 97.
Yeah, 1897. That's correct. During the so-called airship craze that was kind of sweeping the nation in 1896 and 1897. So this reported crash of a UFO in this tiny Texas frontier town called Aurora, which is near Fort Worth, Texas. And being a resident of Texas myself, born and raised here, I've always been fascinated by that case. So John and I got together and we started kind of brainstorming about other cases from the 1800s that went along with the Aurora case. And pretty soon we had documented information on literally, I'd say, close to 1,000 cases.
1,000 cases?
Yeah, pretty substantial sightings and contact experiences, including animal mutilations, a lot of the things that we really didn't become public until, say, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, including a couple of near abduction cases, although they ended up not taking the people involved. But all of this, for it to have occurred as early as the 1840s, 1850s, was just remarkable to us as the book developed out. And John and I were kind of just talking to each other, not believing what we were finding, just waves of sightings, especially in the latter part of the 1800s.
It's just amazing to think, because I was doing my research, too, before the show. And I guess in the 1800s or in the 1890s, during the time of the sighting of the Aurora case, which we'll get into later on in the hour or later on in the show, they counted up to about 108 to 109 sightings in Texas alone during that time. And as you had pointed out, they were called airships back then. They weren't called UFOs or flying saucers. That was all a product of the media during the 1940s. And now we got the UFO the way we have it now. But they had nothing to draw upon. They had nothing to draw from. I mean, we always say, well, it could be that, we see UFOs because of science fiction. We see flying saucers because it's been programmed into us. They really didn't have anything to go on. I mean, John, did they describe them in other ways besides airships?
Boy, I think the first time they used the term flying saucer was, what year was that, Noe?
Well, in the famous case about the farmer in Denison, Texas, in the 1860s, he used the term saucer when he was trying to describe what he saw flying in the air above him. It was a famous daytime sighting, in 1878, as a matter of fact. So that was the first time that a UFO was described as being saucer-like.
Well, that's
and the term did not come into the general use to describe unidentified flying objects until the 1940s.
Right, with Kenneth Arnold. We got to take a break right now, but this is fascinating stuff because I didn't even know that. I always thought that it was in the 1940s, but I guess in the 1800s they used the term saucer to describe what they were seeing in the sky. Tonight, Noe Torres is my guest, and John LeMay. They're the guys that have teamed up to write a fascinating book called The Real Cowboys and Aliens, and I was fascinated by this subject because of the movie Cowboys and Aliens that's out right now, which is not part of their book, but it's still a fascinating topic. 19th century, out west, you're alone, a UFO? Kind of weird, isn't it? We'll be back.
101 FM KXL, Oregon's station of record.
We bring you this special radio television broadcast in order to give you the very latest information on an amazing phenomenon.
Enter a world of the twisted and deformed.
Sound you hear is the warning bell on my time machine, letting me know it's time to return to our own world, our own time.
Prepare yourselves.
Strange and unusual
I myself am strange and unusual.
Welcome to Ground Zero with Clyde Lewis on News Radio 101 FM KXL.
I'm Clyde Lewis. This is Ground Zero. We're so happy to be here with a great topic tonight and great guests, too. We got Noe Torres with us and John LeMay. They're the guys that got the book, the only book, really, that's worth getting about cowboys in the Old West, the Real Cowboys and Aliens. Tonight we're talking about the 19th century UFO cases that you probably didn't learn about in school. You didn't read about in a Louis L'Amour book. No, Roy Rogers didn't talk about it, and I don't think the Lone Ranger and Tonto had a chance to have an encounter. 503-417-9595. That's 503-417-9KXL. Or 1-877-733-1011 if you have a question for my guest tonight or if you have anything that you want to add to the conversation. Both of them are historians, both of them involved with the various UFO networks. I want to ask either one. Let's start with John. I want to ask the questions about history. Now, we do know that the Wright brothers hadn't flown anything until after the turn of the century. So we do know, though, that the French had dirigibles, or they had made airships. What are the chances that they were making the airships and flying them over the United States during that time?
Well, I actually know of a story here in New Mexico. I can't remember the year that it happened, but it was in a small town called Galisteo, and these people saw a balloon, or more kind of like a dirigible-type balloon ship just floating over their city, and they claimed that they could hear people talking and laughing above them in kind of a strange language. And if I remember right, they dropped down some paper with some strange writing on it, and then years later they looked at the paper and it turned out it was Chinese writing. So I don't know about the French, but possibly some Chinese apparently flew over New Mexico in a dirigible. That's all we really know about that story.
Wow. That's just, I can't even fathom that they'd be sitting there looking up and they see people laughing and probably waving at them and then dropping papers in a different language they don't understand, only to realize it was from China or from some other country. And most of these UFO cases, and another question I have, the UFO cases that we don't hear much about in the 19th century, could it be because of education and the fact that communications were not as advanced as later on in the 20th century? Is that fair? Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I know these stories ran in a lot of the newspapers at the time. You know, it would start out in a very small town paper, and then it would get picked up by the larger papers across the country.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure about that. I mean, possibly for the ones overseas, I guess, but the ones in America, the stories seem to spread around pretty well.
Right. And Noe, do you have any in your research you've done? What are some of the, I guess you could say, the reactions? Fear, maybe even thinking that what they were experiencing was something that was divine? I mean, do you get any of that kind of information when you're studying and looking up these stories about the 19th century UFOs and alien encounters?
Actually, this is a very interesting topic, and that is the reactions of the folks back in the 1800s to these apparitions. Sometimes they refer to them as like biblical signs and wonders in the sky.
Mm-hmm.
Taking us back to that time period, if we focus on what life and culture was like, American society back, you had a society that was, you had very rural areas, small towns and villages spread out over a large area, especially in the Southwest. You didn't have any very many large population centers, and news, as you pointed out a while ago, news traveled kind of slowly. The mass communication channels that we have available now that we take for granted, there was nothing like that.
Mm-hmm.
You had, the very early beginnings of telegraph communications, and telephones didn't come until much later. There weren't many electronic devices, or there were hardly any, as a matter of fact. Light sources, artificial light sources, were very, very were in their very rudimentary forms.
Mm-hmm.
So this was a completely different world that these people lived in, and there were a lot of superstitious beliefs. One of the things that I was talking to somebody recently about was the fact that science did not hold such a large sway on the general population of the United States back in those days. There wasn't an immediate attempt to find a scientific explanation for some event that occurred like this,
right?
Like we see today. When we see an object in the sky that can't be explained, we first attempt scientifically to exclude all possible alternative explanations or earthly explanations before we start calling it an unidentified or unknown element. So, but this sort of, extension of scientific thinking to the everyday life of the people in the 1800s, that was not the case.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times these encounters with strange beings and strange objects were looked at from kind of a superstitious or religious angle, definitely.
Yeah, I would think that they would, because if you see something strange, immediately you have to. I mean, people were, I think, far more religious, far more. They had their religious practices, and they were very staunch. I mean, a lot of them were they left other places because of religious freedoms. I mean, religion was one of those big things. And I mean, if it were me and I didn't know much except Jesus and my family, I certainly would probably equate something from the sky coming down like that as being something from God and not extraterrestrial. Because I mean, I think a lot of people have a hard time conceiving I mean, when you go see a movie like Cowboys and Aliens, we've already assumed what the aliens are. We already know what they are.
Right.
The reaction, though, I think would be far more frightening. And that's the thing. I haven't seen the film yet. I think I will go see it, but I have heard that the reactions are something that are probably not believable. But I would think they would be far more effective if they had a film where they are terrified, or at least thinking that something they saw was from God or from some supernatural entity entirely. I mean, one of the things I found interesting, I was looking over a lot of stuff that you guys have written, and it's on the internet. One of the things I find interesting is that with all these UFO sightings that you have claimed were seen in the 19th century, what happened in the 20th century at the turn of the century? The spiritual movements, all of the paranormal spiritual movements, and the gatherings of people who said that they were communicating and channeling and all those other things. I mean, I think that what had happened is maybe a few people did see these things, they encountered these things, they kept the secrets to themselves, and then eventually became gurus and spiritual leaders. What do you think of that idea?
That's a very fascinating idea that you bring forward, because a lot of religious revivalism occurred around the end of the 18th century,
mm-hmm.
the beginning of the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
There were some very large religious movements that actually are traceable back to the end of the 19th century. You had groups such as the Latter-day Saints. You had a whole bunch of Second Coming type groups. A lot of churches that went on to become, more or less mainstream religions that arose in frontier towns and in other small towns around America,
mm-hmm.
right at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century.
Exactly.
That's a fascinating theory, yes.
Well, and here's another one for you. I'll throw this by you, too, because I was, doing my studies, reading what you guys have written and stuff. Here's something to think about as well. You look at the Latter-day Saint Church. You look at Joseph Smith. You look at, he was in New York, and he claimed that beings of light came down in a forest and told him that they were, one was God and one was Jesus Christ. He also was visited by another being who told him about a golden book that he had to dig out of the ground that was translated from Reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics, the same hieroglyphics and what looked like Egyptian hieroglyphics, because I remember the Lumley case where Lumley had said he believed that what he saw on that rock or whatever it was Reformed Egyptian glyphics. Now, how did he know that?
It's very interesting. There's actually a number of religious movements from that era that claim to have visitations by heavenly beings and revelations of a unique nature. And it kind of shaped American spiritualism for decades to come and extends even to our day. And it's also interesting that a lot of these groups from the late 1800s, early 1900s felt that it was somehow we were entering a critical phase of human history and human spirituality, centered right around the turn of the century.
Yep.
And many of these groups interpreted it as being signs of the second coming of Jesus Christ.
That's exactly right. And, it's fascinating, too. One of the books that I was acquainted with when I lived in Utah was the Owaspy. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the Owaspy, but it's considered to be another type of Bible or a scripture thing. And I remember the story of how the Owaspy was founded. It was in 1880. A guy by the name of John, I don't know how to pronounce his name, I think it's Newbro. He was a dentist. And one night he was in his room, and these beings came to him, told him he had to be a vegetarian. They handed him a typewriter, and they said, don't worry, sit at the typewriter. They gave him 6 months to change his diet. And they said, sit at the typewriter, and you'll be able to write the will of, what do they call themselves? Something called the ambassadors. They were called the ambassadors of the angel hosts of Jehovah or of heaven. And they said that they visited the earth every 3,000 years to reveal themselves to certain people and have them write the will of whatever the God was that they were talking about. And I just found that interesting that it was I think 1880, Joseph Smith, and then I don't know whoever else. I mean, I think the Jehovah's Witness started at that time. The Revivalists started at that time. Blavatsky started. Christian Scientists. Blavatsky, the Theosophist, started at that time, and then we eventually evolved into the Vril, and then the Nazis.
God as well.
Yeah, exactly. And it just seems to me that maybe if we can go back, we can trace the roots of some of the dispensationalist religions from extraterrestrial contacts and sightings in the 1800s.
Now, here's another interesting thought, and that is that there's been a lot of people who have written and talked about the possibility that our society has been contaminated or changed by philosophies or ideas that were introduced into our culture deliberately by extraterrestrials or by these anomalous beings that we normally refer to as extraterrestrials.
Right.
So this would fit in with what you're saying, that all this way of thinking, this mode of thinking, these religious ideas were implanted into our culture in this critical time period when we were just entering the industrial society age, the age of industrialization, the coming of machinery, factories, the beginning of what we know of as modern society, the building of machines, leading to the building of computers, more sophisticated machinery, and leading to finally to our modern age of instant communications,
right,
worldwide networks,
right,
and it's all fascinating how this implantation of or implanting of these religious idealisms occurred during this critical time period, right before society took this important turn at a critical juncture in our Earth's history.
And you know what's really interesting? As you're talking, I was thinking of this. So, okay, we have the alien sightings, we have the UFO sightings or the airship sightings in the 1800s, and then in the 1900s we go through this change, and it's true, the industrialized change, industry changes, communication changes, we become warlike. Okay, the wars start happening. Our war machines get more intense, and then after that happens, we have another encounter in the 1940s, and that encounter does the same thing over again. We get better equipped with our flying machines. Our flying machines get more advanced. Our armies split up. Our governments change. The way we look at ourselves change. We go to the moon or we go to space. It's just amazing the way it's going in cycles like that. Noe and John will be with you. We got to take a break. This is such a fascinating topic. I'm glad you're both on the show because I don't know if it just seems to be this cycle that whenever the aliens or whenever we hear of these mass encounters or whatever during a century, it always leads to a new kick into the evolutionary cycle. And I think this is some remarkable information we're getting. We'll be back with more. Keep it here on Ground Zero.
Got an opinion? Call KXL now. 503-417-9KXL or 877-733-1011. Back to Ground Zero with Clyde Lewis on News Radio 101 FM KXL. Ground Zero with Clyde Lewis.
Noe Torres and John LeMay, my guests tonight on Ground Zero, 503-417-9595. It's 503-417-9KXL or 1-877-733-1011. Tonight we're talking about Cowboys and Aliens, the real story, the truth behind all of this. Was there ever a time, your book and your writings, both of you, is the only book really out there that sums it up the best. I don't think anyone else has done it better. Have there been other, I guess you could say, amazing stories or comic book stories about Cowboys and alien encounters?
Well, believe it or not, the movie is actually based on a comic book. Did you know that, Clyde?
I didn't know that.
Okay, yeah, so that's actually where the movie comes from, as a graphic novel.
Okay.
And, me personally, though, I think that the comic book was inspired by an old Far Side cartoon by Gary Larson. I remember a long time ago I saw a cartoon that he had drawn of a cowboy on his horse pointing his gun at a flying saucer that was chasing him, and the caption was, Hollywood's long romanticized concept of cowboys versus aliens. So I really would not be surprised if the author of that comic book saw that and said, well, that actually is a good idea, and nobody's done it. And, I'm really surprised it took them that long to do it. I'm really shocked they didn't do a film back in the 1950s that was like Cowboys versus Aliens.
Well, I know they had a cowboy vampire film. I remember watching it one late at night and just thinking, wow, this is bizarre. And then they end up killing him with a bullet that has a cross, carved into it or something. But, they did everything with vampires and cowboys. But I always thought the same thing. I always thought, I wonder why they never do a story about that, because that is the only time in history that I know of that really isn't covered about cowboys and aliens and about what their reactions were, what was going on with them at the time, and how it shaped perhaps our spirituality for the coming centuries. My guests tonight is Noe Torres and John LeMay, Cowboys and UFOs, the real cowboys, the real UFOs, the real stories. We're going to have more coming up on Ground Zero, and your questions, too, at 503-417-9595. That's 503-417-9KXL, or 1-877-733-1011. Wouldn't it be weird to know that many of the way we look at Christianity, maybe how we look at religion, was all because of the fact that our ancestors were influenced by some of the experiences they had that they thought were divine, when in reality, they were extraterrestrial in nature? How would that make you feel? We'll be back with more. Keep it here on Ground Zero.
through the cracks. Just when you thought you were safe.
The loudspeaker spoke up and said,
Wait, Sammy.
the loudspeaker spoke up and said,
Wait, Sammy.
the loudspeaker spoke up and said, give up, give up, give up, give up, give up.
Wait, Sammy. Wait, Sammy. Wait, Sammy.
I'm Clyde Lewis, and this is Ground Zero. Ground Zero tonight, a wonderful program about cowboys and aliens. Yes, they did have encounters with each other back in the 19th century, back in the 1800s. Many accounts, many things to talk about tonight. Cowboys and Aliens is in theaters, but this isn't about the comic book. It's not about the movie. It's the Real Cowboys and Aliens, as put together by my guest tonight, Noe Torres and John LeMay. Guest tonight talking about the encounters between people in the frontier and aliens. We had a great discussion in the first hour about how perhaps these alien beings may have influenced a lot of what we see today as religion and spirituality. Maybe even influenced our industrial age, because we see that when they did show up at the end of the 19th century, that things started to change for us here in this country. And it's some really fascinating talk about this subject, and we're glad to have them on the program tonight. I wanted to go back to the James Lumley case. We did touch on it a little bit. The Montana, he was a trapper. Am I right? He was a trapper, correct?
Yeah, he was
Yes, a fur trapper. That's
Okay,
correct.
he was a fur trapper, and it was in Montana where he saw this thing crash, whatever it was?
The exact location was somewhat vague. It was in the Rocky Mountains in Montana, but as far as a fix on the exact position, it was around an area known as Cadotte Pass. That's Cadotte, Cadotte Pass. He was at a very high elevation when he saw this bright object streaking across the sky. And he later told a newspaper in Cincinnati, because he was doing some traveling at the time, that the object was a bright, luminous body in the heavens, which was moving with great rapidity.
Mm-hmm.
So a few seconds after he spotted it, he noticed that it was coming down toward the ground. It split into several pieces, and then it crashed nearby, and he later went visited the site. He had experienced what he described as a very loud explosion that jarred the earth beneath his feet, and then that was followed by what he described as a rumbling sound like a tornado sweeping through the forest, and there was also very strong wind associated with that. So it was at that point that we got to what we were talking about earlier, where he saw this large object embedded into the side of a hill, and it had strange symbols or writing on it. This was covered by several newspapers back in that era. And one of the significant points we need to remember is that science fiction did not even exist when these cases took place. The novel that is probably seen as the beginning of the whole science fiction literature was, of course, H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, which was published in 1898.
After these reports.
Yeah, it was like 30 years after the Lumley case. And most of the cases covered in our book, it was decades afterwards.
This is such a revelation for me.
Yeah,
it really is.
One of the fascinating things, Clyde, that about researching these early UFO cases is that you can go back in time and you can approach it from many different angles. You can find many different sources that corroborate what happened. Not only that, but these are examples of UFO sightings that occurred long before there were jet planes, satellites, spaceships, science fiction, all the things that have interposed since then in our consciousness and have caused us, as you were saying very early in the show, have caused a lot of distractions. You know, there's been a lot of hoaxes perpetrated on people, and there's been a lot of misinformation about UFOs and UFO occupants in more recent decades. But if you go back to a pristine time before all of this was true, and you study this, you isolate this in terms of historical research, and I think you arrive at a greater truth by looking at these historical cases a lot of times than you do by looking at something that occurred, say, last week.
Well, I'm completely blown away. John, if you want to answer this, back to the Lumley case, did a lot of people, and I've been seeing buzz, a lot of people believe that they could go up and try to find that particular UFO or that particular airship. Is there any truth to that? Could someone actually scout that entire area and see if they could find the remains of that airship?
No, that's the first I've ever heard of that. Clyde, have you really heard of people talking about maybe going to that area?
Yes, I was actually there was a whole forum, and I can't remember where I found it, but it was talking about your writings, and they said, well, obviously then if pieces of that are still there, because there was somebody had said that they also had read with that Cincinnati report that I guess he also said when he came upon the compartments, there were compartments on the ship, and he said he saw it, and he said one of the things that was interesting is that the sand or the dirt that was around the ship had turned into glass. He said it must have been really hot to melt the sand and turn it into like a glass-like substance. And it kind of reminded me of Trinitum, that glass that was formed at Trinity when they blew up the atomic bomb.
Oh, that's a very good point.
Glass at one of the Roswell crash sites. It was Dr. Lincoln LaPaz found an area where the craft had touched down and turned the sand into glass as well.
Wow. See, it seems to all, come together like connecting the dots. Let's go to a call right now. We're going to go to David. Hi, David. You're on Ground Zero.
Hey, great show, Clyde. Your guests are really interesting. And he actually brought up one element of the conversation that I wanted to talk about, science fiction writers. I think Jules Verne lived from 1828 to 1905, H.G. Wells 1866 to 1946. They were 19th century men, and I don't have their books in front of me, but they were writing about some really interesting things. Jules Verne was writing about submarines and things like that prior even, I'm thinking of the Civil War era where they had submarines, and just some really interesting topics. You talked about, the Mormon Church, and I think it was Joseph Smith talking to people that inspired him to dig for golden tablets, and he was about the time of what, the 1830s, Clyde?
Yeah, it was I think 1836, and he was 14. And if you read some of the history about what happened between him and his dad was having the same types of things going on with him, which also adds credibility to the idea that may have been alien or at least extraterrestrial, because families have abduction histories.
Yeah, and the whole thing about this, we're talking about, some of these people living at the earlier, or being born in the earlier mid 19th century. So it just fascinates me, the connection your guests are bringing up this subject up. And have they done a timeline when some of these famous science fiction writers wrote, or even some of these religions, to compare when these sightings occurred in a timeline, maybe like you see like sometimes in history, to see if they even match up, because people are inspired by things that they've never seen before. A lot about religion is faith. If people see visions or things through prayer and various things like that, Why couldn't people be inspired by science fiction writers?
John, you want to take that, or Noe, you want to take that?
Well, I'd like to pop in and say that there's a lot of very interesting ideas that your caller just expressed, and I appreciate the call very much. It's exactly something that we were touching upon earlier, and that is that there seems to have been like something that suddenly became part of human consciousness right at the latter part of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s. Prior to that, the very first work of fiction, major work of fiction that dealt with a possible alien invasion of the Earth was H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds in 1898. So suddenly there was this strong belief inculcated in human society about the possibility of contact between human beings and extraterrestrials. And this expressed itself not only in scientific terms, as in the writings of science fiction authors, but also expressed itself, as we've been talking about, in religion. And there's a very fascinating book that I highly recommend, probably the book about this very topic that I've read that makes the most sense to me and is the most fascinating read I've ever experienced. It's a book called The Gods of Eden.
Yes.
By William Bramley.
We had William on the program, yeah.
Yeah, it makes a very strong case for the fact that human society has been deliberately influenced by messages and messengers from extraterrestrial messengers who have attempted to mold human society in certain ways. And one of the chief characteristics of this tampering by extraterrestrials has resulted in increased warfare, increased racial tension, and increased religious violence among Earth's populations. And we go back in history and we see how many cases over the many centuries of human existence where religious disagreements have led to major violence. And in fact, there were elements of our world war that were religious in nature, with the whole Aryan Christian belief system of the Nazis and so forth. So there's definitely a component of human history and human society that has to do with the agitation of the fact that warfare has resulted from the agitation of religious ideals and beliefs among various subcategories of human society. So that, I strongly recommend The Gods of Eden by William Bramley. A fascinating book.
Great book.
It covers the very things that we've been talking about so far.
Thank you, Dick.
When was it published?
What was?
The book you just described?
Yeah, The Gods of Eden by Bramley. I believe it was published in the late 1990s, right around the year 2000. I don't have the exact date of publication here.
He was a guest on the show. I'll have to look that up. He was a guest on the show a while back. We had him on, David.
Thank you, Clyde.
You bet. You have a great night. Thank you. Bye-bye. Once again, the numbers to call tonight, just give us, hold on one second. Give us a call. It's 503-417-9595. That's 503-417-9KXL. Or 1-877-733-1011. Tonight on Ground Zero, a very special show about cowboys and aliens. We'll be back with more. Keep it here on Ground Zero.
News Radio 101 KXL. Got an opinion? Call KXL now. 503-417-9KXL or 877-733-1011. Everyone is in on the secrets, and big things are being planned. Call Clyde Lewis now. Ground Zero.
Tonight we're talking about cowboys and aliens. And some very interesting, theories that we're spinning, or at least interesting ideas. that I don't think you're going to get anywhere, and as a matter of fact, nowhere else, tonight on Ground Zero. It's a fascinating topic that we're discussing. I know that Cowboys and Aliens in the theaters, but this is the real thing. These are the real stories, and now we're talking about how they've shaped our spirituality, perhaps, with Noe Torres and John LeMay, Cowboys and UFOs. You know, as we were waiting in the break, we've been throwing these theories out there and trying to do timelines. At least I have been, because this is fascinating stuff. How about Percival Lowell? And all this stuff happened, these encounters. Something had to have inspired him to think that there were canals on Mars and that perhaps there's life on Mars. Wouldn't you think, John?
Yeah, and you know, back in those days, Mars, I think, was the only planet that they thought of that was capable of sustaining life. Is that what you kind of remember, Clyde?
Yeah, I remember that. That's what Percival Lowell says. You know, life on Mars. Not a lot of people had said, yeah, we believe that, and also Venus. They were thinking that maybe there was life on Venus too.
Because I know in the case of the Aurora crash, instead of calling it an alien, I'm pretty sure they called the pilot a Martian.
Yep, and I want to get into that after the news. We're going to talk about the Aurora crash. That's a fascinating story. I wanted to spend a little bit more time on that because I don't think a lot of people are aware that, and also Chihuahua, Mexico. There have been precursors, or actually cases that have been similar to what happened at Roswell. And then they get tossed aside because of Roswell. But the one that is the most fascinating, and I remember when I first heard about it, kind of creeped me out, was the Aurora crash in, it was 1896, 1897. It was Aurora is the small town near Dallas-Fort Worth, and something crashed there, and they actually found a dead alien or a dead Martian, and they didn't know what to do with him, so they buried him.
You know something fascinating, Clyde, and we can talk more about this after the break, but it is the only major UFO case for which there is an official state historical marker commemorating the site where the alien is believed to have been buried, and making reference on the historical marker itself to the fact that people reported a downed UFO and the recovery of an alien body there.
Right.
So that is the only official government marker that we know of for any major UFO case in the United States.
It's also highly protected by the Texas Historical Society that no one can dig up the grave or vandalize the grave, because they vandalized, I guess there was a tombstone put there that was taken. It was vandalized. It was, in fact, I remember Jim Marza did the story when he said that there's a V shape on the tombstone and then these little circles, and he believed that there was another part that had the rest of it. So it was an elliptical type of saucer with portholes, basically to describe how that looked, how the UFO looked before it crashed. And we're going to go into detail about the crash as well, I'm sure, coming up after the break. Tonight on the show, the number is 503-417-9595. If you want to call in and give your opinion at 503-417-9KXL or 1-877-733-1011. Noe Torres is my guest, also John LeMay. We got them both, and we're very honored to have them on tonight talking about the subject. You never thought that aliens would be part of the 19th century. You never really hear about the cases in the 1800s, the new frontier. But they were there, and now we're realizing that they may have shaped the way the new century was going to be. And perhaps, as we look towards the 21st century, there may be a time where they'll return again and shape the new phase of our revolution. We'll be back with more. Keep it here on Ground Zero.
News Radio 101, KXL.
News Radio 101 FM, KXL, Oregon's station of record.
Well, let's just beat off. What's going on anyway? Hickox, Jingle, Sourdough, all of them vanishing into thin air. Weird about this whole thing.
Invaders from Mars.
of evil to the Great West.
Invaders from Mars
Ran rampant,
pillaging, robbing and terrorizing,
endangering peaceful citizens,
attacking wagon trains. Invaders from Mars. He saw them land from outer space. He saw them capture innocent people only to destroy.
I'm Clyde Lewis. This is Ground Zero. Tonight, the real deal aliens and cowboys. Alien encounters on the wild frontier. Who would have thought that back then, all of our pioneers and cowboys and all those folks in history were encountering aliens? I'm fascinating stuff with my guests tonight, Noe Torres and John LeMay, Cowboys, UFOs. Glad to have them on the program tonight. We've tackled a lot of great topics, a lot of great ideas coming from both. Let's talk about the Aurora encounter. John, let's go through the history of the Aurora encounter to start, and then we'll get into some of the weird stuff that happened after all this went down with the well and the water and everything in the area. There's some really scary stuff that happened after the thing we thought was dead and buried. Go ahead.
Well, Clyde, when I first approached Noe about doing this book, he told me he was very excited about the idea because for years he had been collecting information to do a book solely on Aurora one day.
Mm-hmm.
So Noe was the one who wrote that chapter, so I'm going to redirect you to him in this case since he's the expert.
Go ahead, Noe. We want to hear. The Aurora case has always been one that's haunted me. More so than any other alien case in history. So go right ahead. Let's hear about this.
Yeah. One of the earliest UFO cases that I became fascinated with growing up in the 60s and 70s was the Roswell UFO incident of 1947, where a UFO crashed, bodies were recovered, over 100 witnesses said that they saw either the bodies or the debris from the crash, very reliable, credible witnesses all over the town of Roswell, New Mexico. And then later on, when I was reading books about similar cases, I ran across this little-known story from 1897 about a Roswell-like incident, that happened half a century before in North Texas, and that happened in 1897. It was on a weekend in April in 1897 when the townspeople noticed what they described as a cigar-shaped UFO that kind of gleamed in the sun, a metallic silver color gleaming in the sky above them. This tiny little frontier town located in the area around Fort Worth, Texas, and it was streaking across the sky with this object, and it collided with there were a number of newspaper reports about this later, which is a source of the story that I'm telling tonight, including the Dallas Morning News newspaper at that time, as well as the Fort Worth newspaper, both reported on it. So this object came streaking across the skies of Aurora, Texas, and it collided with a windmill, actually one of these old frontier windmills that was used in that era to pull up the water for the livestock to drink. And this windmill was located on a famous or a prominent landowner in the town named Judge J.S. Proctor. He was the owner of the property and the windmill where this crash occurred. So after crashing with the windmill, then the object fell a short distance away, and the townspeople of Aurora actually went out there with great curiosity to see what had landed, and they found among the scattered metallic fragments of this object that crashed, they found actually a person, a humanoid, described as, and this is a quote from the Dallas Morning News, one of the townspeople one of the witnesses described the occupant of the crashed ship as not an inhabitant of this world. Another person quoted in the article, a Mr. T.J. Weems, an officer in the U.S. Signal Service, and quoted as an authority on astronomy, was the one that made the connection to Mars, which John was talking about earlier in the show. He stated in the Dallas Morning News article that the occupant was most likely from Mars, the occupant of the crashed ship. So so then the townspeople they checked the body of this creature, and they found that he was carrying papers, actually. But the language or the symbols on the paper, once again, you have these mysterious symbols that recur in these types of cases. Nobody could decipher what was written on those papers. They speculated that this was a record of the humanoid beings' journeys, but they were written in some form of, quote, hieroglyphics. So once again, we have the appearance of hieroglyphics at a UFO crash site, something that has recurred in many, many other cases. So now the newspaper article has this interesting passage, very brief, I'm going to read here. The town is full of people today. This was the day after the crash. The town is full of people today who are viewing the wreck and gathering specimens of the strange metal from the debris. So, as John and I were working on this chapter and communicating back and forth, we speculate that somewhere, probably in more than one place throughout that area of Texas, perhaps in somebody's attic or in some boxed up in some out-of-the-way place and forgotten for many decades, are probably pieces that were collected from this object that crashed in Aurora back in 1897. So it's a fascinating case. Also was reported in the Fort Worth Register. And the townspeople, feeling sorry for this poor man who had died in the crash, decided to give him a proper Christian burial there in the Aurora Town Cemetery, where many people believe that the buried body of the extraterrestrial exists to this very day, buried in the town cemetery of Aurora, Texas. And right at that cemetery is where this historical marker has been placed by the State of Texas Historical Society, and the marker says in part that it tells a story about, quote, a spaceship crashed nearby and the pilot killed in the crash was buried here, according to accounts. So a fascinating case. There's been a lot of research done over the years into the case, and we can certainly explore other angles of it as well.
Yeah, I found it interesting, too, that they had to put a guard on it because people wanted to excavate, and they still won't allow an excavation of the grave. They said there's some excuse that they're afraid that other graves will be disturbed, and so they don't want that grave disturbed at all. I find that fascinating. That, and then apparently UFO hunters, when they did when Bill Burns did his investigation, they brought some radar or underground radar type of contraption that saw something, but they said the grave was so deteriorated they weren't able to make out any, skeletal remains or anything like that.
Yeah, we're talking about a case that occurred, over 100 years ago, and probably physical traces at this point would be extremely difficult to come by. But it is interesting, as you say, that witnesses reported that there had been a marker placed at the burial site, and there was a report in 1973 when this story first kind of surfaced, although it had been reported, in those early newspapers, but it had basically been ignored, and a lot of people still today don't know much about it. But in 1973, there was a reporter named Bill Case who described, who saw the marker, who ran across the marker, and he described it as having a strange design on it resembling a flying saucer with portholes. So it was shortly after this reporter wrote about seeing the marker, and his story appeared in a local newspaper there, and somebody came along, unfortunately, and basically stole the grave marker, and it was at that point that people kind of lost track of exactly where the location of the buried pilot was. And there's been subsequent research done, chiefly by one of the prominent UFO researchers in Texas, Jim Mars, and several others over the years, and some interesting stories have come out of that. But the naysayers and the scoffers have always maintained that this was a story that was created by the local residents of Aurora to kind of spur tourism to their area. But it seems to me that if that had been the case, it didn't work very well, because the town of Aurora kind of dried up and blew away. There's nothing much there today. So,
right. It was already dying anyway. That's what they were saying. It was just dying on the vine anyway, because the railroad passed them by. A number of things. They had, I guess, some very bad crops and whatever. I mean, one town can easily die, and a lot of people were saying that that's the reason why they came up with a story. But I don't understand if they've come up with a story as a hoax to bring people to the town, then why is it the registry, the historic registry, keeps it pretty much guarded? And why do they put that marker on there? Let's go to a call right now. Let's go to Julius calling from Mount St. Helens. Hi, Julius. You're on Ground Zero.
Hi. How are you doing today?
Great.
So, very fascinating subject. I studied a lot of Egyptian history, and all the advanced technology, which to me kind of led me to the way that they might have had some visitations. And I became a Christian about 10 years ago, and I've been reading in Revelation, in Book of Revelation, and it describes the New Jerusalem descending from the sky, and it describes the size of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was 1,000-mile square cube.
Okay.
And to me, it's just fascinating, and just in the spiritual realm, that the things that we don't see, like in different dimension type thing.
Right.
That I believe that some of those visitations could be negative and some could be positive.
Sure.
To where it affected, how we were talking about religion and different, Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses and so forth.
Right. Well, a lot of the charismatic evangelical churches have come from that as well. I mean, most of the stuff you're hearing about, I mean, a lot of the religious influences that we're experiencing now, the way they're being interpreted, the way they're being handled as dispensationalism, happened around the time of these sightings. Not just Mormonism, not just, I mean, the Protestants and all these others, they still have their religions, the Lutherans, the Catholics, but some of these charismatic religions, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons, the Pentecost, the new Pentecostals, I'm talking about the old Pentecostal, new Pentecostal movements, they're all based on these charismatic dispensational belief systems that the end is coming. And it seems that even when you look at some of the abduction cases of the 1960s, Julius, they say when they're abducted, the aliens tell them that the Earth is going to have an environmental or some sort of environmental destruction, that something's going to happen to the planet that's going to send it into a tailspin of the end, and we need to do things to change now or whenever. And it just seems like the same programming. The world's going to end, act accordingly, pretty much.
Exactly. And like even described like in Paul was visited, by Christ.
Yeah.
But it was a beam of light.
Right.
That blinded him.
Right.
And then who is to say what it is? People don't understand the nature of God. So
that's right. And
we have it described, in a primitive way.
Mm-hmm.
But it could be so far advanced that the book cannot describe it in those words.
Yep, and that's the thing. These people, these time periods, the 1800s, they didn't know how to describe it because they'd never seen anything like it before. Thank you, Julius, for the call.
Thanks.
Thank you. And tonight on Ground Zero, the numbers to call 503-417-9595. That's 503-417-9KXL or 1-877-733-1011. Tonight, fascinating discussion about aliens, cowboys, the frontier, the Wild West, the 19th century visitations, hardly spoken of. My guests tonight, Noe Torres and John LeMay, talking about it, and fascinating stuff that we're talking about tonight. If you want to get in on the conversation, by all means, 1-877-733-1011 or 503-417-9595. We'll be back with more. Keep it here on Ground Zero.
News Radio 101, KXL. You're listening to Ground Zero on News Radio 101 FM, KXL. Ground Zero with Clyde Lewis.
Noe Torres and John LeMay, my guest tonight on Ground Zero. We're talking about cowboys and aliens. We're talking about the frontier. We're talking about how they're not really spoken of that much. We have a new movie out, but that's kind of the comic book version of everything. But tonight we're getting the real story and a very deep conversation about how we look at this time and how it's changed a lot of things in our lives. Maybe even influence our religions and everything else. Fascinating stuff. You know, I wanted to talk about as well, the guy who bought the property from the judge in Texas actually had a well that he had on his property. He put some of the metal down in that well, and he was drinking water from it. And I was reading that he got arthritis, but I looked at the pictures. He had something worse than arthritis. What did they determine he had? Who was the guy? It was like in the 1940s. He was drinking the water from the well after being exposed to the UFO or whatever it was.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. We don't know exactly what the relationship is to the Aurora crash, or but it's been there's been conjecture that because of long-term exposure and drinking the water from that well where the pieces were reportedly thrown in, that as a result of that he developed this very severe arthritic-like condition. And if you look at pictures of his hands and his arms, you'll see that his skin actually developed these bumps. It almost looks sort of like leprosy. So it definitely was something more severe than just a normal case of arthritis. And this poor gentleman obviously was, people speculate that he was exposed to something chemical or of some kind of substance that was possibly leached from the metals from the UFO crash. So that's been an interesting topic that was brought up by Jim Morris and other researchers.
Yeah, it was interesting because I had read that, in fact, in Wikipedia, they say, well, the man who bought the property from the judge put a well up, and then it was about 1945 or 1947 or something. And then what had happened is that he stopped drinking the water out of the well because he developed arthritis. And I thought, well, why would that be something to be concerned? I mean, people get arthritis when they get old, some of them do anyway. And then I had decided to type his name into Google and see if they had any pictures of him. And all they had were pictures of his hideous, deformed hands and how it just deformed him. And it was a horrible, horrible picture. I'm going to be putting the pictures up on my website, too, with my article that I'm writing called Aurora. And you'll be able to see, eventually, when we get the article up, exactly how these looked. Noe Torres is my guest tonight. John LeMay, tonight on Ground Zero, talking about the aliens and cowboys, the real story. They have a book available, too. We're going to find out how we can get that book. And just some fascinating stuff that I didn't even know it would be spitting into how it's spitting tonight, and I'm finding it very fascinating. If you have anything you'd like to comment or talk about, you can call in tonight, ask some questions of my guests. 503-417-9595. It's 503-417-9KXL or 1-877-733-1011. A bit of history that you won't learn in school and you won't see on Little House on the Prairie. We'll be back. Keep it here on Ground Zero.
This is the President of the United States. Who is this? Is it you again?
Look behind you.
This is my private line. How did you get through?
They're everywhere. All the time. We see them every day. But you have to look behind you.
There is nothing behind me. How did you get this number?
The spaceman told me.
What spaceman?
It doesn't matter. I'm telling you about monsters. Please, you must look behind you.
Young lady, there are no monsters in the Oval Office.
The loudspeaker spoke up and said,
Wait, Sammy.
the loudspeaker spoke up and said,
Run away, Sammy.
the loudspeaker spoke up and said, give up, give up, give up, give up, give up.
Wait, Sammy. Wait, Sammy. Run away, Sammy.
I'm Clyde Lewis, and this is Ground Zero. Tonight, the Real Cowboys and Aliens on News Radio 101 FM KXL in Portland, Oregon. So far, we have been enlightened about the frontier alien invasion. Did these aliens show up in the 1800s to people who were traveling across the country, pioneers, scouts, you name it? And when they showed up, how were they being seen? As divine entities? Alien? I mean, they didn't have, according to my guest tonight, they didn't have science fiction to influence their thoughts. They had to interpret these experiences by what they knew. And so we got off into this idea that perhaps they were looking at it as a strike from the divine. Noe Torres and John LeMay, my guests tonight on Ground Zero, authors of the Real Cowboys and Aliens, talking about Aurora, talking about the crash there in Texas where they buried an alien being, where a man was harmed because he drank some of the water that was in a well where some of the metal had dropped. And just some real fascinating stories, and these are well recorded and they are documented. You heard them say that there was a historical marker that was placed there by the Texas Historical Society. They've guarded the grave there in Aurora. You can't get to it. It's some very strange things. We're going to go to Susan now, who's calling in. Hi, Susan. You're on Ground Zero.
Hi, Clyde. I had something I wanted you and Noe and John to reflect upon. In the chat room, we were discussing the concept of the rapture. You mentioned dispensationalism earlier, and I was wondering if this concept of the rapture, which really is more of an 1800s doctrine, that concept of being taken up into the sky, could that have had an origin with this increased ET phenomena during that time period?
John, what do you think of that?
Huh. I'd never put those two things together before. That's an interesting thought.
That is interesting. And Noe, what do you think? Do you think that maybe that whole... I mean, I know that the concept of the rapture was developed in the 1800s, and that it was part of the dispensationalist gospel.
Now, here's something that John and I were kind of talking about during one of the breaks, and that is that if you boil down all of the world's religions to their core essential beliefs, what you have is every major religious philosophy on earth at its core is about communion or communication between the human and the extraterrestrial, which referred to as the divine. So we have contact between those of us, those mortals, those of us who are mortal here on earth, and these higher powers, heavenly beings, and or the actual creator of the entire universe. So all of religion in this context then is in essence, it's a communication between mortal humans and extraterrestrials. So now getting back to your caller's question, the concepts that began being espoused by several of the major denominations that came out of the 1800s were based, you talked about the charismatic movement, you talked about dispensationalism, and the caller is now asking about the rapture. Now you've got a more direct connection between humans and these higher powers, these heavenly beings.
Mm-hmm.
Now you've got, in some cases, in the case of some of the early forms of Pentecostalism and so forth, you've got heavenly beings actually entering the body of worshipers in a certain aspect. They feel the presence of, and there was a lot of talk about the Holy Spirit, which is something that really wasn't present in earlier forms of Christianity. Now suddenly you had God incarnate, God coming into the bodies of the worshipers, and you also had this notion of the rapture, which is a time when God would call His followers, and they would be lifted up into the air to meet Him. And of course, we know that there's a lot of interesting parallels to things that have happened during in close encounters with UFOs and their occupants. So it's a fascinating idea that some of these notions that began to develop there around the turn of the 20th century.
It's probably far more. It happened probably far more than we realize. I mean, some of the stories that we have that have been written about by you and by John and maybe some of the other people that have explored even the Aurora case, they haven't got in depth as maybe Bramley when he was talking about how wars are kicked off by aliens arriving, from Gods of Eden. But I don't think anybody's really taken this on and said, well, look, there's a part of the UFO culture, part of the ufology that has not been covered properly, at least extensively by several authors. I mean, you guys have covered it. Your book covers it extensively. But to have anyone go in and cover it even further and say that perhaps some of these people who had visions, like Joseph Smith or Newbruff or whomever at the time, having visions to tell them that this is the way religion should be, not the way the religion was, it would be fascinating to see if we could find the timelines and also connect the dots. I mean, I even remember in my readings about Victorian magic that John Dee actually had encounters with what he called the Enochian angels, and that he was using certain types of writings and numbers that he had to sing to contact them. So, I mean, this was another thing that over in England that people like John Dee, who was a magician, apothecary, decided that he wanted to contact these Enochian angels, that he could contact them by singing a number of notes that he felt were written in some sort of an angelic hieroglyph or whatever. So this all comes together really nice, you guys. I think this is a really good, fascinating show. I really am glad you guys are on. Thank you, Susan, for the call.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Jim, hello, you're on Ground Zero.
Oh, hi, Clyde, Noe, and John. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I had a couple of questions. What part of Montana did the Lumley case came in? You said it's some pass somewhere, but I couldn't pick up the name.
The actual location was an area known as Cadotte Pass. That's Cadotte, Cadotte.
Is that in the Rockies?
That is the Rockies, yeah.
Yeah, in the Rockies. And if you do a search on the internet for Cadotte Pass, you'll find that folks have written about it. There have even been some efforts to locate it and come up with the coordinates using Google Earth and so forth. In the context of people who are familiar with this Lumley case from 1864, are trying to locate the actual place where it where it occurred. So you'll find some chatter on the Internet, actually, about trying to locate the specific location.
Was he a miner or something, his job?
He was a fur trapper.
Fur trapper, okay.
Yeah.
I have heard, what's the fellow's name? Hugh Ross, who's a astronomer and a pastor. He figures all this stuff is demonic, and I was wondering if you see a spiritual element or a demonic element in UFOs, or is it just sort of like a paraphysical or something? How do you see that? It's a real head scratcher.
For the first time in human history, we are able to look at religious writings and religious teachings from the perspective of 21st century science. Okay, never before in history, obviously, have we been able to do that.
Right.
So, Clyde was mentioning earlier that in the Bible and in other religious writings, we have words and symbols and expressions used where the persons who were witnessing extraordinary events were trying to put into their language what they were seeing. And it wasn't always very descriptive. They weren't always very successful in explaining to us this divine manifestation that was occurring before them. Well, now we can go back and we can analyze those writings, and we're coming from this 21st century scientific viewpoint. You know, we've had many decades now of where the nature of the universe, the nature of physics, and the other sciences have revealed to us what the universe is like. You know, the elements that compose it, the stars, the planets, the galaxies, and so forth. We have a lot more information now, so then we can shift our perspective and go back and look at some of these stories and writings. And it lends a new perspective on it all. Now, so heavenly beings, then, good versus evil. You know, these were concepts that were kind of simplistic for the simple folks who lived and wrote in biblical times and in the times of other similar religious writings in other cultures. But now we see evidence that what they were viewing and what they were seeing and what they were experiencing was a lot more complex than their words were able to capture. And even in the stories we've included in our book, The Real Cowboys and Aliens, you've got people of the 1800s desperately trying to explain what's happening in the skies above them. And they weren't very successful because they were trying to use 18th century symbolism and terminology, which included things like, signs and wonders in the sky and supernatural beings and things like this. But obviously, they were experiencing something that, in a different sense, had a scientific explanation. You know, it could be broken down into component parts and looked at within our understanding of the laws of physics and the universe. So that's unique in that perspective.
Do I have time to tell you a story? My sister saw something. She lives in Helena, Montana.
Why don't you hold on one moment? We've got to take a break, and we'll hold you over and have you talk about that just one moment, okay? And we'll be back right here on Ground Zero. We're having a very, very fascinating discussion with my guest, Noe Torres and John LeMay. They are the authors of The Real Cowboys and Aliens. It's available right now. You can get it. Amazon has it. Or you can go to RoswellBooks.com and get yourself a copy. It's also available for Kindle. So, some amazing stuff. We'll be back. Keep it here on Ground Zero.
Got an opinion? Call KXL now. 503-417-9KXL or 877-733-1011. This is Ground Zero with Clyde Lewis. Weeknights at 9, only on KXL. Ground Zero with host Clyde Lewis.
Tonight, the real story of Cowboys and Aliens. Not the movie, not the comic book, but we are talking about alien influences in the frontier during the 1800s. 19th century relationships between these beings up there and we down here. It seems like it's a little bit more common than we realize. But I guess tonight we are just excited to actually be talking about this with Noe Torres and John LeMay. We're going to go now back to Jim, who had a question that he wanted to ask. Go ahead, Jim, quickly.
Oh, well, just relate a story. My sister saw something. She was with her husband and his brother and the brother's wife. This light came at them. They thought it was like a meteor. This is at night. This is in Helena, Montana. They're on a hill about 150 feet above the valley floor. So I guess it'd be coming from the north or something, and it's coming at them like it's going to smack them at a fantastic speed. And my sister says something like, "Oh, God protect us," And the thing just stops, and then retreats at an acute angle, goes away, and don't know what it was, but the effect was kind of emotional, like, what was that? And some of this stuff we don't know, and even in this modern day and age, it can take its emotional toll. I mean, it's nice to be able to explain everything, but we can't. I guess that's it.
I agree. It's hard to explain everything. It's very hard. Yeah. Thank you for the call. Let's go down to Hunter. Hi, Hunter. You're on Ground Zero. Go ahead.
Hi, Clyde. Yeah, I noticed you're talking about aliens and somewhat religion tonight.
It's sort of that way, but we're talking about actually aliens in the frontier and how they were in touch with people. Go ahead.
Okay. So I noticed you're talking about aliens and religion tonight, and I was always told by my parents, and they're like major Christians, that aliens...
Hello? Aliens what? Are you there, Hunter? I guess Hunter's gone. All right. I guess I don't know what happened to Hunter. Hunter went away.
We'll never know.
It's almost like da 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 da. You're waiting for da da. It doesn't happen. That's for sure. But it is a fascinating thing to spin into. I'm sure we were talking about the interactions that go on like this, and it just seems to be that it did influence. It did influence a lot of people. And a lot of people is getting their minds wrapping around the possibility of the interaction between cowboys and aliens, and that's the thing. So, did anybody talk about this as some sort of I don't know, some sort of are there any stories about people who have, I guess, lost their minds if they've come in contact with these beings? I mean, it would seem to me that if they didn't know it, it'd probably frighten them to the point of losing their minds.
Actually, John mentioned the underwater UFO, which we can talk about some more after this upcoming break.
Okay.
But that is a fascinating case, and some of the men who witnessed that were received not only physical injuries, but they had a lot of difficulty coping with what happened to them.
Okay, we'll talk about that coming up out of the break. Noe Torres and John LeMay with us tonight on Ground Zero. We're talking about Cowboys and Aliens, the real story of the alien encounters during the frontier, 19th century. And if you have any questions tonight, 503-417-9595, that's 9KXL, or 1-877-733-1011. We'll be back with more. Keep it here on Ground Zero.
News Radio 101 KXL. News Radio 101 FM KXL, Oregon's station of record.
That's what
I was right there listening, and I just couldn't believe it. I heard both stories.
I'm Craig Lewis. This is Ground Zero. 503-417-9595. It's 503-417-9KXL or 1-877-733-1011. My guests tonight, Noe Torres and John LeMay. It's all about cowboys and aliens, the Real Cowboys and Aliens. A book that's out now. Fascinating stuff. Not the movie, not the comic book, but the real stories. Aliens on the Frontier. And we're glad to have them on tonight. In fact, we were actually talking about a case where a group of men were harmed or hurt by a flying saucer or alien encounter. When did this happen?
Well, this is a fascinating story, Clyde, and just to take your listeners through it fairly quickly. And back in 1893, it was in July that this happened. There was some individuals who departed Tacoma, Washington, on a boat called the Marion for a 3-day fishing and hunting expedition. So, and all of this was recorded in several newspaper articles there from the Tacoma area. And after several hours of fishing on the Puget Sound, the men decided to go ashore at an island called Henderson Island, and a specific location on that island called Blackfish Bay. And they decided to camp there and spend the night. And they were within about 100 yards of another group of men that were camping there as well. They had been engaged in surveying the area. So it happened that around midnight, several hours later, around midnight, they were all awakened by this incredibly loud noise, and what seemed to be that the entire air or atmosphere around them was charged with electricity, electrical particles. In fact, it said in the newspaper account of what happened that one of the witnesses said that every nerve in his body felt like it was being stung, and also there was a light, very bright light, such as it was described as the concentration of many arc lights that kept constantly flashing around them. So this incredible event was taking place. Everybody at both campsites were awakened, and they saw approaching the shore of the island where they were camped what they described as a most horrible-looking monster. It was about 150 feet long, and the description sounds more like a giant caterpillar, actually. Although it apparently it looked like it was metallic. It seemed to have the appearance of copper, and there seemed to be electricity emanating from various parts of the body. So this bizarre creature then seemed to be coming up toward shore, and it actually struck one of the men who got kind of close to the edge of the water there, and he was knocked senseless, and so the rest of the men scurried for cover behind some trees. It's really a fascinating account. It stands to reason that since the Earth is mostly covered by water, that these UFO beings would be able to traverse both our oceans as well as our atmosphere. So, and there have been hundreds of cases of submersible UFOs since the 19th century, more in modern times, especially after 1940. We've had many, many cases of unidentified submersible objects. So, but what's fascinating is that this account took place such a long time ago, and the descriptions of what they saw were so vivid. The description, though, would be typical of people living in that area, where they they ascribed to what they saw the characteristics of like an animal, like a sea serpent or a caterpillar.
Mm-hmm.
And in many cases, this is true that objects in the sky were described as bird-like, and objects in the water were described as being some kind of sea serpent. So that would be typical of people trying to grasp the meaning of these signs and trying to describe it in their own language.
Now, here's a weird question. I was looking through as I was studying for the show tonight. I actually stumbled across a story, and I don't know if you know anything about this. Chemtrails in the 1800s, or vapor trails in the skies. Any word about that?
Well,
actually,
we did have a chapter.
Go ahead, Don.
Oh, thanks. No, I was going to say we did have a chapter on what some people call an atmospheric beast, which was the Crawfordsville monster. I think that took place in 1891. Does that sound right, Noe?
That sounds right, yes.
Yeah, basically it was this strange, kind of a formless white object that just kind of snaked through the skies above Crawfordsville, Indiana. One night, and it like they said in the newspapers, it really had no form, and they said it comprised of hundreds of fluttering wings, and it just kind of went over the town and made this strange wheezing noise, and they also described it as having a single flaming red eye. So that is certainly a very strange account, probably one of our strangest accounts in the whole book.
That just sounds creepy. Yeah, I was just reading, though, that a lot of, what was it, these crafts sometimes, when they go over, they leave behind vapor trails or chemtrails, and people said they were like poisonous. They'd have, the air would smell like sulfur, and they just said it was a sulfur smell, a sulfuric smell, and it irritated the throat. And I was reading somewhere about that they had recorded those things, too, and of course, what you just described is the huge, whatever it was in the sky. It was like a one-eyed serpent or dragon that went through the sky as well that they talked about. Which was... It's
fascinating that we have in the book, we have a chapter we have several chapters where we talk about apparitions in the sky that appeared to be serpent-like.
Mm-hmm.
But the accounts of the witnesses indicated that in some cases that the skin appeared to be metallic, and there were also bright lights associated with some of the sightings. Of course, in the 1800s, there were very few artificial sources of light. You know, you had oil lamps and kerosene lamps and things like that. But, for example, before the Aurora crash of 1897, there was actually a very similar incident that occurred in North Texas as well, where a UFO basically exploded over a cotton gin near Stephenville, Texas. And interestingly enough, it was when we were down there covering the recent wave of UFO sightings in Stephenville, Texas, that we ran across this old historical account from 1891, where in the vicinity of Stephenville, there had been this case where a UFO exploded and was seen by the townspeople there. Burning hot metal fell to the ground, setting the grass and weeds on fire, and then people found metallic debris scattered all around that cotton gin, and they found, once again, they found fragments of paper-like material that had a strange language that nobody could identify, that appeared to be hieroglyphic-like.
Here you go again, that hieroglyphic story.
Yeah, and this is actually recorded. I'm looking at. We have in our book the actual article from 1891 in a newspaper called the Dublin Progress from Dublin, Texas, where this story occurred. So you had this fantastic bright light in the sky shortly before the explosion, and as we were talking about earlier, there were no bright sources of artificial lighting back in the mid-1800s. So
right.
This was obviously something totally unknown.
One of the stories, too, in the Columbia Gorge area is a story called She Who Watches. It's an ancient Indian story. I believe it's Chinook, or it's a number of tribes tell the story about this woman chief who had this group that was right there on the Columbia River, and that coyote came down and then said, "Are you treating your tribe well, or are you one of those evil women?" And Trickster told her, "Where I am, or what I do, is that I tell you now that there will be a time where there'll be no chiefs." And then for some reason he turned her into a rock, and this rock has like this Joker smiley face on it that looks over the river, the Columbia River. And I always thought, I was with some friends and we toured that area of the Columbia, I always felt as though that what happened there, of course the trickster coyote is the trickster according to Indian lore. I always felt to myself, though, that rather than, the Native American metaphors that they used were all pretty much based in an alien type of abduction where, they turned her into a rock and they took the tribe with them. The tribe disappeared. And I just have always been fascinated. I just felt as though that maybe something happened there where there was a mass abduction or that happened where I'm sure there are plenty of stories about Indian tribes or Native American tribes that have said this, that they've had these experiences as well. Am I correct?
There are many, many stories, including one fascinating story that we tell in our book among Native Americans and also the indigenous people of Central and South America regarding contacts with extraterrestrials. It's a big part of their folklore and their culture and their history. And in the book, The Real Cowboys and Aliens, John and I have a fascinating story about Native Americans in the area of Northern California back in the 1800s. In 1888, in fact, the story came out that the Native Americans reported to the settlers of the area that for some years they had been observing what they called small moons descending from the sky, metallic spheres that would come down on to the earth, occupied by strange beings who were very friendly appearing, and they would wave to them in a friendly manner. They would wave to the Native Americans of the area, and these small moons that would descend from the heavens down to the earth below would deposit these strange creatures, which the Indians called crazy bears. And it turns out that the description of these humanoid beings called crazy bears that were left behind by the small moons actually fits the description that many of us have heard as the Bigfoot creatures.
Wow.
Which have been seen in other places in the U.S. over the years. So we call our chapter that covers this story Bigfoot from Outer Space, because actually the Native Americans reported that these creatures that all covered in hair and fur, ape-like almost, were deposited on the earth by these small metallic spheres occupied by humanoid beings, from the heavens.
That's
so this is just one example of many stories in Native American culture and in the culture of other indigenous people that indicate a link between us and extraterrestrial visitation, actually.
Noe Torres and John LeMay are my guests tonight on Ground Zero. We're talking about the frontier, the aliens, the UFOs, Cowboys and Aliens, the Real Cowboys and Aliens, a book that they have. It has updated accounts of all of the stories you're hearing about tonight. UFO sightings, of course, recorded throughout history, but we really haven't paid attention to the time in the 19th century where a lot of people were seeing these things and developing strong beliefs about where they come from, why they're here, and whether or not they're going to take people away. 503-417-9595 or 1-877-733-1011. We'll be back. Keep it here on Ground Zero.
News Radio 101 KXL. This is Ground Zero on News Radio 101 FM KXL. Ground Zero with Clyde Lewis.
Noe Torres and John LeMay. My guest tonight on Ground Zero, real aliens, real cowboys, not the stuff from movies, but some fascinating stuff tonight on Ground Zero. And, gosh, it's one of those shows where you just, you're running out of time, so I'm going to hurry and get to a bunch of calls. Let's get to Charles. Hi, Charles, you're on Ground Zero.
Thanks, guys. Earlier in the show, you were talking about how ETs have potentially influenced society in the past. I had a quick thought on that. If we consider that these ETs have been evolving for countless eons, clearly they're far more advanced than we are, and that undoubtedly these ETs number in the tens of trillions. I wonder if we as humans are like entertainment for these ETs. I'm curious what your guess and what you have.
Thank you, Charles.
Thought on that.
Thank you. What do you think? You think we're entertainment for them?
No, I think it'd be more serious than that if they try to influence our world affairs.
Yeah, I don't know. I tend to think I have a Fortean view that we don't necessarily belong on this planet, and they want to just kind of let us know that they're the stewards of the planet. Hi, Brian. You're on Ground Zero.
Hey, thanks, Clyde. Hey, I had a question about the dreams. I was watching a program on Nova about how they say our brains spend so much time on the dreaming state.
Uh-huh.
And I was wondering if that was some sort of if I'm a firm believer in the ancient alien theory that we were created here for a purpose, and I was wondering if that would be some sort of way for them to program us why we are in an unconscious state.
You think we're in an unconscious state and that they're just programming us?
Well, yeah, like when your computer goes into sleep mode, it's when it updates.
It's a good point, Brian. Thank you so much. That's a good point. Thank you. I never thought of it that way. It's kind of interesting. Back to that old idea that we could just be brains in a bucket and somebody in Arizona is walking around and just giving us a squeeze every once in a while. Anyway, Noe and John, thank you so much for being on the program. And I think this is probably a more edifying and interesting experience, probably far more than I had planned. What do you guys think?
We really enjoyed it. It's one of the most fascinating experiences of being on your show tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Clyde.
And we'll keep in contact if you guys have any other books or anything else you want to talk about. I'm sure there's a lot more than just what we're talking about with the 19th century. I'm sure you guys got a whole bunch of stuff to talk about in the regular 21st century and beyond. So thank you both for being on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night. And that's another Ground Zero for tonight. We're going to be back Monday with some more stuff. Be sure to spread the word that the show's out here. A lot of people still don't know that we're here, and we are here and happy that we're here. So please, spread the word. And another reminder that if you're listening to this program on podcast, be sure to be generous and donate to Ground Zero. We need to maintain some things, and we need a little help. And a lot of people say they love the podcast. We have about 6,000 subscribers. If every one of you gave us $1, we'd be able to take care of a lot of things and maybe have some really amazing events. So be sure to help us out. The donate button's right on the front page. Just go to groundzeromedia.org. We also have T-shirts and other things available. So we'll see you again Monday. Thanks for listening. Good night from Ground Zero.
News Radio 101 KXL.